Howdy, folks. A quick apologies in advance. I recorded this episode at nighttime, so if you're watching it on YouTube, the image quality zooms in and out and is a bit wonky. But anyways, I hope you enjoy and catch you in there. Bye. Welcome to Eco Show. This is a show about ecology, the environment, happenings in that space, and news, any different little things that may be going on, presented in a digestible fashion. And so it's nighttime now when we're recording. We just had our time change where I'm at, so it is now darker earlier because we're moving into the winter time in the southern hemisphere. So we may have a few more nighttime recording sessions coming up, but I think the lighting may be looking okay. We'll find out soon enough. Okay, today we've got, and so in the show, if you haven't been here before, we go through an animal of the week, and then we talk about recent research in ecology and the environment from this past week. And then we'll talk about news or popular articles that may have happened to pop up this past week. So let's just hop into it. The animal of the week this week is the nutria. And no, that's not nutrient. It is nutria. And its Latin name is Myocastor coipus. And myocastor is made of the Greek words myo and castor. Myo means mouse, and castor means beaver. So this animal, if it was to be compared to something, it would be most similar to the ROUSs that are in the movie Princess Bride. Put a big image of those. And that's sort of why I wanted to do these this week, because I had never heard of them before. I knew there were large rodents, like capybaras, that were pretty well known, but I did not know about these fellows. And I think a random YouTube video popped up about people in Louisiana who were hunting for them. Because as we'll find out, they are an invasive species now in Louisiana. So they are a large herbivorous semi-aquatic rodent. They live in burrows along stretches of water and eat plant stems. They're native to subtropical and temperate areas in South America, and they were introduced to North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa by fur farmers. So there was popular hunting of beaver and things like that, and apparently people thought they could make a buck on this, but overall they didn't really have too much great success with it. And in many of these places it is now considered invasive. It also transmits diseases to humans via water contamination. So these rats are hanging out in at least I shouldn't call them, they're not rats. These nutria, which is the name, which I think, nutria means otter in Spanish, I believe is where the name came from originally. But they're not otters. So they look like a big old rat, considered invasive, and because they're swimming around in waterways, they're semi-aquatic. They're having their bowel movements in the water, and that transmits diseases to humans. Salmonella, I believe, is one of the many diseases that'll pass on. It looks like a big rat. It has big old red teeth, which are due to some of the iron in its teeth. It has a skinny, hairless rat tail, and it can weigh 4 to 9 kilograms, which is 9 to 20 pounds. And they are 2 feet long with a 1.5 foot long tail. So in total, it can be 1 meter long with body and tail. And they have got web hind feet, so they're really built to swim around in the water. And just to show how adapted they are for the water, they have nipples on the sides of their body, so young can feed in the water while they're in the water. So as you can imagine them swimming around and young being able to feed on the side of the mama. Males and females look the same. They only live 3 to 6 years. I'm not sure how long usual rats live, or if that's sort of normal for rodents, but I was pretty surprised. Last week we were talking about termites, and termite queens could live for up to 30 to 50 years, so that these are so big and live for such a short amount of time is kind of surprising. Males reach maturity at 4 months and females around 3 months. Gestation takes 130 days, and they may have up to 13 offspring in one gestation period. There's an average of 6 litters per life and 2 per year. So they're not living for long, but they are pretty much straight from the go. They're rocking and rolling and producing young. So you can imagine how, if this gets loose in your swamp, it's going to be populating it pretty quickly if it's not being controlled. It will attack if cornered. And as we've seen in Princess Bride, you don't want to fight an unusually large rodent because they do not mess around. They're usually nocturnal, and if food is scarce, they'll be active in the day. But if there's plentiful food, then they'll be grooming in the day. So if you see nutria out and about during the day, know that they're hungry, and you got to watch out for them. It's like when the whole thing of if you see a cockroach in your house, it means that there's too many cockroaches in the walls. If you see them in the daytime, if you see the cockroaches in the daytime, the old story is that means there's not enough space for them in the walls, so they have to come out, which is super nasty. Their ranges will expand or contract based on the seasons. So this was kind of sad. They were describing how in the wintertime, because they have they're used to these sort of tropical temperate climates, so they're really not used to the cold very much, and they've got these rat tails, which are naked long tails, which are easily exposed to the cold. So if it's too cold, then those tails will get frostbitten and they'll just get sick and pass away. So they're pretty vulnerable to cold weather. But when weather is warm, they will just shoot up waterways because they live in fresh water. And a little history is that they were introduced to Louisiana in the 1930s, and they got out after a hurricane down there, I think in the 50s, that went through a nutria farm, and they went out and about and were populating the area around there. they'll consume 25% of their body weight daily, which sounds like a great way to live. And they'll go after native crops like lawn grass. Well, it's not a crop, but that's hanging around. They'll go after popular things like lawn grass, alfalfa, corn, rice, and sugarcane. And they are actually extinct in their own range because they were over harvested where they're from, which is an interesting thing. You'll see that a lot of times in invasive species. I think the same is true with possums from Australia. In New Zealand, they're an invasive species, but in Australia, they are not doing too well. And so part of the issue with them when they go after crops is that if they can't get anything from leftover bits and pieces from the whatever the thing they're eating, they'll go after the root and they'll just tear up the whole plant. And so that's pretty bad in some marshes and things like that. Oh, they are, in some places in the U.S., they're being made into dog food. So that is not great for them, but it is okay for dogs, I guess. So I think it's called, I don't remember what the brand is called, but if you're in the U.S., you may have some nutria dog food. People also eat them, and they're used in Louisiana and ranges where they are because there's not as many restrictions on hunting them. People will eat them and stuff like that. So it may be marketed as a cheaper meat and good for people living out in the swamp areas, maybe more remote areas. Could be a decent meat source. One of the techniques that they'll use to catch nutria is that they'll capture one of them and then they'll catch it, sterilize it, release it, and follow it. And it will take the people who are tracking it back to the sort of nest where there will be a lot of them. And yeah, that's called a Judas, taking a Judas catch or something like that. So a little bit of a bummer for the rest of the crew. But it is hunting it or trying to clean it up yourself can be tricky because it looks a lot like beaver and muskrat. So it'll be in the habitat of other animals that may be desirable to have around. That's particularly a U.S. problem. So that's pretty much the main information about that. I just thought that was cool because it was the closest thing to an ROUS that we've got, which is a rodent of unusual size. So that's our animal of the week there. Now we're on to research. And this week we are looking at the journal Nature Sustainability. I'm trying to breathe outside of the microphone so there's not that sound in there, but it may be leading to weird noise gaps. So, trying to make it a high quality sounding podcast for anyone listening or imagine, well, most people are going to be listening unless you're reading the captions on YouTube, in which case, hello. And I just waved. Okay. So our first, and we've got a few, how many have we got? We got one, I think we've got about 5 articles this week. So kind of a quick animal of the week this week, but we've got a lot of sustainability related news articles. And the first article was talking about socio-ecosystem productivity and how it is threatened by drought heatwave events. So with climate change and whatnot, we are getting more drought heat wave events, which are or compound drought heat wave events, which is just what it says on the tin for the most part. And so that means with climate change, you're having greater chances of drought and you're having more heat wave events as well. And when you combine these together, you get lots of issues. And they are talking about productivity. They were talking about productivity in terms of personal and sort of like economic as well as like plant productivity. And so in plants, productivity is talked about in a few different terms, but it's just basically talking about how much a plant is growing and things like that. So in this article, they're just pointing out that these events are becoming more frequent and productivity is at risk. And in particular, I thought an interesting thing that they're pointing out is that the folks who are growing and producing food, they have their GDP, so their gross domestic product, or their sort of worth, their net worth is most at threat. So people who are living in more rural areas or who have livelihoods that are based more on off the grid, they're much more exposed to these sort of issues. This is expected to increase, and this another sort of tack on issue of this is that when you have these compound issues of drought and drought and heat wave, you're going to have plants not doing as well, and so they're going to be sinking less carbon, so they're going to be capturing less carbon because they're not going to be as productive. This also jeopardizes grids. Droughts and heat waves put electrical grids at risk. And in the United States from 2011 to 2013, there was a $60 billion cost associated with these issues. And plant recovery is often slow after these sorts of problems. And like we said, severe impacts in rural and poor areas. So this one wasn't too much of a fun read. It was a bit doom and gloom, but that was interesting to point out and to think about these issues. Sometimes things are worse than you expect, and sometimes they're not as bad as you'd expect. And that's what we'll find in some of these articles this week, is that when you look at the bigger picture of things, sometimes things aren't as bad as we expected them to be, and sometimes they're worse. So we tend to think about droughts and heat waves as their own things, but actually the compound related issue of these two things can be really disastrous. And it's looking like there is a greater chance of those coming around. Okay, our next article is more actual sustainability. Okay, and who's that one by? That article was titled Future Socio-Ecosystem Productivity Threatened by Compound Drought Heatwave Events by Jiabo Yin et al. And our next article is titled Advancing Life Cycle Sustainability of Textiles Through Technological Innovations by Lisha Zhang et al. And this is a cool article with lots of great figures talking about just what the title is saying is life cycle sustainability of textiles. And I'm kind of skeptical when people are like talking about technological innovations as the one thing that's going to save everything. But it is important, and it was cool to get a little overview of that, and in particular just to think about the whole textile life cycle is not something that I'd really thought about before. So textiles, according to this article, produce 5 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions and consume the second largest amount of world water in terms of during their production. They also pollute with microplastics and chemical agents. So this is a really extractive industry, in particular because you can think of the main textiles are usually either synthetic or a natural plant, and oftentimes those natural plant is cotton. And those synthetics are coming from fossil fuels. So you can imagine a lot of water goes into producing cotton for cotton clothing. But surprisingly, synthetic clothes don't actually take a lot of water to produce, but they do pollute waterways. So the life cycle of textiles starts with the extraction of the substance to make the textile, the process of making the textile, distribution of the textile, and the disposal of the textile. So it's cool to think about. This is sort of a key way of thinking about sustainability, is thinking about these cycles or these life cycles. And one of the big polluting and water taking up part is the coloring part of coloring textiles. And also another thing that they're pointing out, which I didn't think about, is all the detergent used by the user while you have your textile. So the whole thing is pretty brutal, even from the consumer perspective, like the consumer just by washing it, because that detergent, when that goes into your waterways, that's not good for streams and things. So I'll put up this image now, which is the first image of this sort of life cycle. And this is just a big sort of circle image pointing to the processes that go on. So we start with our raw materials, and fibers are produced from that. And those textiles may be then converted and made into a garment. Then they're distributed, they're used, and then they're disposed. And this disposal pathway is a pathway that has a lot of different options sort of to go on. So when garments are disposed, they may go right to the landfill, they may be incinerated, they may be reused, or mechanically recycled. And the mechanical recycling, they're talking about a few different options for that and how that can happen with synthetic fabrics. So that's just our life cycle there. Now I'll take that down. So just a nice big life cycle image. And the next image that we're putting up is an image that is, what's this one all about? It's got a lot of stuff going on. It might be a little bit big for the screen, to be honest. It's just talking about the different fiber types. So you can get fiber from synthetic things, which may be from recycled bottles and stuff like that. It may be straight from petroleum products, or it may be bio-based synthetics, so you can make synthetic stuff out of plant materials and then chemically transform them. Or you can get them from these textiles from organic sources. So that's what that one, they're just talking about different sources. So I'll take that one down. And our last little image here is another little dense one. And that has got the different processes that are involved with yarn and fabric production and coloration and finishing, and then effluent treatment. So they're just pointing out in this article all of the different stages of the textile production and how you can incorporate either recycling or, well, yeah, it's usually the technology that they're talking about is usually a sort of recycling method for these synthetic things. So lots of options put in here. So it was cool to see all of the different technological solutions there are for doing this sort of recycling thing. So I'll take that image down now, but that just had a lot of, we're just talking about different stages and different options that can be used to do that stage in a more sustainable way. So good to think about the things, and definitely reading that was making me seeing, in particular, hearing about all of the impacts of the process of textile production. That was making me think about my own habits with buying things. I don't really buy stuff that often, but there's a nice, something feels good about, oh, I'm buying a new thing. Like it feels fancy or something like that. Feels good about that. But when you're seeing how big this industry is, definitely makes you want to have things that are reused and recycled and not have any plastic in it whatsoever. Okay, that's all for that one. We're now, and I'm doing more hand motions around my face when I'm changing the article so I can just, if I need to edit anything, it'll keep it easier. Anyways, so our next article is titled Coral Reefs and Coastal Tourism in Hawaii, and it's by Bing Lin et al. And it basically is just looking at the relationship between coral reef diversity and tourism, because tourism is talked about in sustainable development goals as a way to, bring money into communities that are around biodiversity hotspots. And so they're exploring the health of coral reefs in relation to areas that are popular for tourism. And they were finding what you'd expect, which is more live coral, so more pretty coral, attracts more people, and increased visitation leads to degradation. And this is in Hawaii, so that's sort of what you would expect to see, which is unfortunate though. And these are economically valuable, and this point that they're making is that if tourism is really going to be helpful to protect and fund biodiversity, then you can't be harming the health of the thing that is supposed to be your resource. So it's good to see some research that was looking at this in a kind of interesting way of doing the research. They mapped out coral reefs and coral reef health, and they found by looking at people's social media. So it must have been some brutal brutal hand-done work because they were searching hashtags and things like that to see where people were at and where people were more likely to be, or different coral reefs, like where they were tagging themselves in Instagram and things like that. So it was a cool use of social media and open social media for doing science in a way that I hadn't thought of before. So if you want to do, if you got an idea for a science thing to explore, you may have, there's so much data out there right now, you can probably do some pretty interesting things. Okay, so if you find a nice reef spot, don't tell anybody about it. Let that reef hang out, chill on its own. Coral reef's done. All right, and on to our next article, talking about Qatar and its vulnerability to oil spills and its implications for global gas supply. And this is by Thomas Anselain et al. So 25% of liquefied natural gas come from, this is either 20% of their own or 20%, I think it was 20% of global supply of liquid natural gas comes from Qatar and 30 sites in Qatar. They also get all of their drinking water from those 3 sites because they use primarily, if not completely, desalination to produce water, which is wild to think about. It's like, and they do a bit of agriculture as well. They're talking about their agriculture is expanding, and so they're, all of the fresh water for people there and all of the ag is mostly done with desalination. So they're pointing out that they are at a pretty big risk of, if there's an oil spill, this is going to heavily impact their water supply. And people hadn't really quantified the vulnerability before. So yeah, there's no groundwater, and they mostly use desalination. So they're pointing out, hey, if you guys get an oil spill, this is going to impact your water production and is going to impact global supply of LNG, liquefied natural gas. So it was kind of a, like, kind of talking about that this is bad for them, but also like 20% of the LNG source, they're like, hey, you guys need to keep an eye on this and have a good backup for oil spills because so much of the world relies on you for LNG. So if you're Qatar and you're listening, definitely recommend checking out this article. They basically just said to get some really good monitoring in place so you can get a quick idea if there is any sort of oil spill in your area. Moving right along, we are on to navigating sustainability trade-offs in global beef production. This is by Adam C. Castonguay et al. And they made some pretty big number claims in this one, which I thought were pretty large. I didn't go through the references on these, but it was encouraging information. And they did usually, because the beef thing is so political, sometimes, it's like oil stuff with research is, whenever there's research on it, you kind of want to be skeptical. But they were pointing out that reducing eating meat and beef is an important thing to do. So if people don't say that, that's sometimes a red flag. So they said that, and then they sort of qualified that information. But yeah, so they're talking about basically beef production and where that can happen and how it can happen more sustainability, basically. So they were saying that by shifting production area, composition of feed, and land restoration, there can be reduced emissions by 34 to 85% from the beef production sector. And that's without increasing costs. So let's see, what are we saying here? And if you increase costs, then you can do even more. So that initial 34 to 85% emission reduction is without increasing costs. And they used fine resolution mapping to look at production areas. And some of the primary emissions from livestock and beef production are from enteric fermentation, which I believe means cow farts, land use change, and that was 40%. So land use change being forest getting knocked down to produce pasture. So sort of and they're rationalizing, looking for these other options because behavioral change required to get people to stop eating meat can be slow. And they're pointing out that beef production currently supports the livelihoods of 600 million smallhold farmers. So we've got an image here, and this image is showing what are we looking at? Where expansion can happen, where productivity can be increased, where productivity stays the same, where to have lower production, removing areas production, and restoration. So big point of this was basically saying, like, if you shuffle things around, you can save a lot on emissions. So by doing production in areas that are more suited to being grassland and then restoring sort of forested areas, you can have lots of benefits. Removing areas from production. And so that was so there's a minimum cost and then a minimum greenhouse gas thing. And so they're showing what to do to get the best outcomes for either minimum costs or minimum greenhouse gases. And then they have this third area, which is showing agreement or disagreement, which is we have aligning of goals for these things. So, yeah, those main numbers I thought were pretty interesting, that shifting production area, composition of feed, and land restoration can reduce emissions by a large amount. And the image shown here is a big global image, but it can be refined down to smaller areas. The tricky thing is that most agricultural production is done on kind of on a private scale, which I don't think it should move to be a public thing, but you can see, for example, when we're looking at the minimum cost options in Australia, we have huge areas that are recommended for lower production, removing from production, and restoration. And when you just think of what it would take to do this on a large scale, they were talking about people, behavioral change being a challenge because people aren't going to eat less meat. But I mean, shifting the whole global production of agriculture is pretty wild to think about. But I guess what could be done is using this as a sort of guide for countries to put in what's the word? Countries they basically, at least in developed countries, they may give out money basically to just grow or not grow what the government says. So that happens in the US a lot. And if you had a big national map of where to grow things, where to grow what, where you can expand beef production, where to minimize it, as long as you've got a national scale way to incentivize people to do that change, then I don't see why it wouldn't work. But it would be a big thing to do. Yeah, especially looking at Australia, anywhere when you're thinking about, it's easy to look at the globe and sort of just be like, oh yeah, you can change this or that, but there's just so many smallhold farmers, even in areas that are dominated by big multinational production companies. It still is hard to imagine those shifts happening, but still is an interesting thing to think about. So we got this image out. If you've got a farm, be sure to look at it. See if maybe you'd be recommended to make that change, because realistically, the only thing that is going to be easily done by anyone at this point is productivity increase. If you're a landholder, that's the only one that you're going to be like trying to do. But if you're already growing livestock on the land, you probably already know how much you can produce on it to begin with. So, interesting article to think about. That's what research is cool for, to think about these big questions. And our next article, we've got 2 articles left, so hang in there. Our next article is titled Forest Conservation in Indigenous Territories and Protected Areas in the Brazilian Amazon. This is by Yuanwei Chin et al. And they are pointing out that many conflicts between conservation and development are in the Brazilian Amazon. So you've got people wanting to knock down trees to increase pasture, and you have got people, and in particular indigenous people who are living there, who obviously don't want that to happen. And they are saying that the effects on indigenous territory and protected area are not well explored. So here's some numbers. From 2000 to 2021, so over a period of 20 years, indigenous territory or and protected area increased to cover 52% of forested areas in the Brazilian Amazon. So that is pretty cool that there's that increase in protection. So there are a lot of efforts to increase protected areas. And in the Brazilian Amazon, there was 12% forest loss in that time, which is a huge amount of forest loss. And they were saying that between 2003 and 2021, forest loss fell 48% due to strict protection. So those numbers overlap in a way that makes sense. You have basically a 50% increase in indigenous territory and protected areas over the 2000 to pretty much 2020 period. And you have a 50% loss, I guess a 50% decrease in forest loss over that same period. So those align well. However, they were pointing out that from the period 2018 to 2021, the rate of loss in indigenous territory and protected areas was twice that of non-designated areas. So there was a bigger increase of loss in indigenous territory and protected areas than in areas that were not specially designated that way. And they're pointing out that that is due to a recent weakening of policies in Brazil. So lots of political issues lately over there. But they're showing pretty clearly that when you protect these areas, and they were looking at Google Images so you can really see how much area is being knocked out. So they can say with some good confidence those initial numbers about how much was saved over that period and showing how much was lost in those recent periods. So a good article pointing out the importance of protecting what you're trying to protect, basically. And our last research article now is titled Limited Quantity and Quality of Steel Supply in a Zero Emission Future. This is by Takuma Watari et al. So a zero emission, a zero carbon emission future depends on decarbonization of steel production. Steel in my heart. And zero emission steel is possible, but it's limited by scrap downcycling. So steel production is hugely carbon intensive because the main thing is it just takes a whole bunch of heat to heat up the steel. And I believe there is a bit of fossil fuel use in the production of coke, which is used to produce steel. But the main thing is just heating it up. And scrap downcycling is just taking scrap steel and using it in basically construction projects. and that just sort of takes that steel out of circulation. So it's good for construction, but it's bad for having being able to reuse steel, So it's kind of like taking your recycled t-shirt, and instead of taking it to the Salvation Army, someone can take it and use it again, you're like, I don't know, putting it in a wall or something. You're using it to build a tent, which is kind of cool, but when you use it to build a tent, then it's not as easy to recycle afterwards. And let's see. I've got percent here for 20% for autos, 60 for buildings. What was I talking about there? Yeah, zero. So zero emission would mean that we could only produce 40% of current levels of steel. So being zero emission by 2050 would mean that we would have to be using 40% of current levels of steel. And the tricky thing is that in automobiles, they're switching to becoming electric, but they're still going to be using a lot of steel in their physical production. So they're pointing out in this article that we'll need better technology and upcycling that doesn't currently exist in order to, or at least doesn't exist at scale currently, in order to have a zero emission steel supply. So we've got some big notes for big peeps this week. If you're from Qatar, we've got a good article for you. And if you're in the steel industry, that's a big opportunity. Decarbonizing the steel production cycle. It's all very big things, very interesting to think about. It's good to know that it is being worked on. Sometimes it can feel like not a lot is happening. When you're reading the news, you're usually not hearing about this stuff. But the thing is, by making things sustainable, it tends to make people money. So people are working on it. And you could be working on it too. So, if steel is your thing, that's a big area of research. And you can bet your bottom dollar that there's some nice, juicy research grants for zero emission steel production. Oh, baby. That has got to be the place to be right now, because steel is one of those things that is just, there's no other material that's, at least to my simplistic construction / building knowledge, there's nothing like steel, that really has that much potential. Okay, we're on to the news now. You made it through the research and we're on to the news section. I'm doing a wavy hand thing to indicate that I'm into the news. This has been an interesting recording this time. It has felt much slower than usual, or much more mellow, so this will be a good thing for, if you need to go to bed, you can just pop this on and fall asleep immediately. I think that's the sort of target audience. It's like bedtime listening. Go to bed just listening to some facts about ecology and the environment. Okay, so we're on to the news. I'm going to start with some bad news, unfortunately. But it was big in the news, so I wanted to cover it, and it is the Antarctica current. So we know that the ice in Antarctica is melting, and some researchers are saying that this is their modeling is showing that it's going to cause slowdown in deep ocean currents. And this deep water flows could decline by 40% in 2050, according to these researchers. And the article that I was reading and getting this from was the BBC, but there would have been a research article associated with this. And so deep water flows declining. This is the sort of day after tomorrow situation. If you've seen that movie, it's kind of an older movie now, but basically in the movie, there's a slowdown in ocean currents and it makes things get really cold. So currents carry heat, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nutrients. So it's not just water. All of these things are contained in it and are being circulated. And when those get circulated more slowly, you're going to have some big impacts. This article is warning that this could reduce ocean's ability to absorb CO2. So because you're having a slower turnover of water, so you can imagine this. I'll do some sort of image here that's trying to show what these currents do. But when you have a slowdown of that movement, that means that, and so this is, if you haven't heard this before, oceans absorb a lot of carbon dioxide. And when they're moving more slowly, they're going to fill up with carbon dioxide, and you're going to get a slower refresh of water without carbon dioxide in it. So that's one of the many issues that they're warning about. And so if oceans are able to hold on to less carbon dioxide, this will put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which will then lead to more warming, which could lead to even slower currents. So that's not a good feedback. That's not what we want. And around Antarctica, ocean currents move downward, and cold, dense salt water sinks and moves down, and that sort of gets currents moving and things like that. But when you get the inclusion of less salty water, which is coming from Antarctica because the ice is melting, and you have less salty water moving on top, then that downwards movement slows. So some other information is that ocean circulation in the Atlantic is weaker than in the last 1,000 years and significantly different in the last 150 years. And that last 150 years aligns with when we have been increasing carbon dioxide production into the atmosphere and therefore increasing ice melting. A way to think about these currents is like the lungs of the ocean. So they're moving oxygen and carbon dioxide around and through the depths. And also, when you have less circulation, less overturning happening in these currents, it means less nutrients are being brought up. So you have lots of things that are living in the ocean producing, dying, and when you have less overturning, you're just going to have less things going on in general. Let's see. Have we got anything else? And this has not been included. So they're saying that Antarctic meltwater has not been included in any of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports yet. But it's expected that this will have some very big impacts when it's incorporated in. So this was modeling based. So, take it with a grain of salt, but probably take it with a wheelbarrow of salt. And if you have that wheelbarrow of salt, put it in the ocean. Help it be more dense. So not great news to start out with there, but there's some research being done on it. People are keeping an eye on it. And let's move on to some good news. We've got some good news from wind farming. A 2-year wind farm study found that no bird hits happened after 10,000 videos were taken. But they did see in videos herring gulls, gannets, kittiwakes, black-billed gulls were around and about, and most birds kept a 50 to 230 yard distance. They used radar and photos to see how close birds were and to see what birds were around. Surprisingly, other studies have found high mortality of seabirds around wind farms. So this research is interesting because they I think it was also funded by a wind farm. So that's a reason to be suspicious. But if it is really true what they found in this case, then that's exciting because it may indicate that they're either doing something to keep them away that's working really well, or they've by chance placed these in such a way that it doesn't align with movement and migration pathways. So good to see that there's a wind farm not hurting the birdies. And we've got some concrete research. Concrete made in Finland with carbon negative replacement for cement. It incorporates leftovers called slag from smelting. And this is from the production of different ores of different metals. And they found that when they mix this into concrete, they get a carbon negative cement. So that's pretty good to hear. Again, the building industry is so massive and produces lots of carbon dioxide. But if you can have building materials that are absorbing carbon, that is very cool. Okay, our next news article is that some research on methane is positive. So methane, CH4, I believe is the chemical lettering for it, is a potent greenhouse gas, and its effects may not be as big as usually thought. Sources of methane include coal, gas, and agriculture. So this is kind of the classic cow farts situation. And some research from the University of California, Riverside, which is a very reputable university, has said that methane production offsets some of its heating because their research found that methane increases low-level clouds, and that offsets shortwave energy from the sun while not increasing the amount of energy that's absorbed near the Earth's surface. So still not great to be releasing methane, but it does offset some of the warming that it causes because it creates these clouds that reflect sunlight instead of keeping it absorbed. So these are sort of articles that I love to see because the whole Earth system is just so infinitely complex that something like methane you think is really bad, and it still is not good, but this article is just showing that the way it interacts with heat and warming on Earth is not as expected. And that's sort of what I think reading the circulation article. It definitely seems as though it'll be not good, but also ocean currents are so complex that it's hard to know what will happen. But it seems that it does seem pretty straightforward. I just like to, I kind of tell myself things like that just to stay positive. Okay, and our last news article is just about plant photography. And apparently there are a lot of native plants that are under photographed. So they'll be identified and drawn in some way or another, but there are very few photos of native plants in their native habitat. And apps like iNaturalist can be used to record local species. So I recommend checking out iNaturalist. I'm not sponsored by iNaturalist, but it's a website where you can upload photos of local plants and animals and join a community of people around the world that are taking photos of plants and animals and things, and you can help preserve and keep a record of native plants in their native habitat. So recommend checking that out. And that's about it for today. I don't feel like I described the ocean current thing particularly well. I'm probably just going to leave it as is, but the main message is that from that article, that news piece, was that fresh water is coming off of Antarctica and it's causing a slowdown in ocean current movements. And when you have slowed ocean current movements, you have slowed absorption of carbon dioxide and slowed movement of nutrients. So there are major impacts for fishing industries, for ecology, and for energy and heat absorption. So the specifics of deep ocean currents, I don't really have the grasp of in my head at the moment to describe it well, but that's why I would say the major message of that is. It is a cool thing to read about, though, so I'll definitely be reading about ocean currents and how they move after this because it can be an interesting thing to learn about, and I encourage you to check it out too to learn a little bit about the ocean current system. So that's it for this week. I hope you all have a good week ahead, and we'll catch you soon. Bye-bye.